Welcome to Next Gen Mentoring Forum. The Next Gen Mentoring Forum series is to empower, educate, and illuminate individuals who are in or interested in the financial planning profession. At each of the forum, an expert will discuss a topic in the field of financial planning with the purpose of inspiring critical thoughts and discussions. In today's session, I have the honor to interview Dr. Jason McCarley on the topic of can robo-advisors help financial planning professionals? My name is Dr. Chia-Li. I am an assistant professor and director of the financial planning program at California Lutheran University. I am a certified financial planner practitioner and maintain an active financial planning practice specializing in succession program management at Value Growth Institute. I've authored 3 award-winning books. Next Gen Mentoring Forum is sponsored by California Lutheran University School of Management Financial Planning Program. We offer MBA in financial planning that helps financial advisors pursue a leadership position or grow their financial planning practice by deploying advanced financial planning with effective client communication and streamlined practice management. I am honored today to have Dr. Jason McCarley. Dr. McCarley is a professor in the School of Psychological Science at Oregon State University and has previously held faculty positions at University of Illinois and Flinders University in Adelaide, South Australia. He conducts research in the area of human factors and applied cognition with a factor on attention, signal detection, and human-machine collaboration. And so welcome, Dr. McCarley.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah, in your recent published article from Journal of Financial Planning back in December 2019, the title of the research was Human Interaction with Automated Aids, Implication for Robo-Advisors. Robo-Advisor is one of the tools that being used often in financial planning industry. Let me just go through some statistics. So Statistica estimated that in 2019, the Robo-Advisor managed about $1 trillion in the US and $1.4 trillion globally. Now, Investopedia, they predicted the size of the robo-advisor market by 2020, which is last year, was $2.2 trillion. So I think that there's a lot of money in stake, whether or not one uses robo-advisors or not in their practice. Would you be able to share with us in terms of some basic definition about automations and decision-making?
Sure. So, well, I guess, as you mentioned, I'm coming from human factor psychology, where we study human interaction with technological systems with the aim of trying to just make people better drivers or better pilots or air traffic controllers. And a kind of central area of research is how do we interact with automated systems, where an automated system is something that takes over and does a job that a human might otherwise, or a human used to do. And I guess we became interested in robo-advisors because they're kind of technically a kind or a form of automation. I guess, well, so as you see in the slides there, they again take over something that the person used to do. What we're interested in particular and what we're talking about here are statistical decision aids. So decision aids that kind of help us make choices or make judgments under conditions where there's a lot of uncertainty. So it's impossible to be right. And the aids themselves, give us a best judgment, but again, are not themselves guaranteed to be right. So kind of the aim is to improve the accuracy of our predictions, the accuracy of our judgments. Let's see.
And so my questions here is oftentimes that we are obviously surrounded by all sorts of different technologies today, where
Sure.
if I go to Google, that I search, recently I got some thyroid over the benchmark. And so if I continue to search thyroids within Google will recognize that. And then when I go to a different website, looking at things, the marketing of the advertising surrounding the thyroids, some sort of mechanism will stop popping up in my website. So there's a lot of data being collected in the background and data being used to produce these kind of statistical decision for us. So the questions would be from the financial industry perspective, are there, by using robo-advisors, which is a statistical decision aids based on your definition here, are there some inherent biases or potentially could harm consumers in some way?
Oh, I don't want to say that there aren't or that there's no possibility. What in lots of domains, and this has been found in financial planning as well, but in medicine, in admissions decisions, say the university, in say forensic accounting, what we find is that these kinds of statistical aids or even very simple decision aids tend to be, in a sense, smarter than us. So if I'm predicting how well students are going to do when they're enrolled in our graduate program, and I'm making judgments based on GRE scores or GPA or whatever, usually a very simple statistical rule, a regression equation, something as simple as that, will outperform humans, be better at predicting, again, student success. There was, again, examples from financial planning a few years ago in Sweden, I believe it was, people were sort of enrolled automatically in retirement plans. If they didn't override the decision, they were enrolled automatically in kind of an automatically robo-advised plan. But they could, if they wanted to, opt to sort of override that and make their own decisions. And in fact, at the start of the program, the government was encouraging people to do that, sort of encouraging them to be active and take over for themselves. After a few years, it was pretty clear that the people who were that actively engaged were actually doing worse than the people who were just sort of following the robo or being managed by the robo-advisor. So in lots of contexts, what we find is that, again, people just underperform these kinds of statistical decision aids. The other thing we find is that even though the aids are better than us, we don't like to use them. We tend to ignore their advice or prefer to override them if we can. I'm sorry, go on.
Yeah, so my question is that, so it sounds like if we let the machine make the decision for us, such as, I guess in this case is by default, they enroll into the retirement plan, right? If they don't make any changes. So by default, we are already automating it. So unless you opt out, then you are automatically participating in it. So we basically took one of those biases away from human. You don't need to make a decision. We automatically put you into the plan. Then I think that the next thing is that there are a couple of things that potentially could happen there. One would be, all right, so you automatically opt in to participate. We also have anchoring effect built in. Let's say we are going to give you 5% in terms of your initial contribution into the plan. And I'm assuming most people will stick with that. And the other thing that we could also factor in is that we could say, all right, now that you have a percentage, let's say 5% contributing on a regular basis, we're also going to default the type of investment that you have in there. So really, we're taking away the confusion side of what percentage to contribute, as well as so many investments to choose from. And so we are really doing so by helping people to more actively participate into the retirement saving. So the questions here is that unless the participant, and according to your assessment, that for those who are actively choosing and picking and things like that in the plan, they might do worse in terms of various different factors. Are you still encouraging the participants to use some sort of human intervention in this case?
So it's, again, by analogy to some of the other literature, say, again, air traffic control or autopilots, things like that. What we try to avoid having the person out of the loop entirely. So that's the other trade-off. So the risk of turning everything completely over to an automated system. One is that, everything's fine as long as the system is working like it's supposed to. And most of the time it probably does work like it's supposed to, but when those occasional cases where it makes a mistake, then you don't notice it. So you want to be involved in monitoring it, watching over it to make sure it's doing what you expect it to. To take an example from outside of financial planning, we occasionally hear stories about a driver or a ship that get lost because the GPS system stops functioning like it's supposed to. So again, those are cases where we just default to trusting the aid without monitoring or watching over it. And most of the time it's fine. Again, occasionally something goes wrong and we're kind of stuck then. So for that reason, we don't want people to totally turn themselves over or turn their responsibility over to the aid. The other risk is that when we're not involved and we're totally disengaged, we lose situation awareness. We lose kind of awareness of what's going on. I think in financial planning, and all of you would have a better sense of this than me. In financial planning, I would think of situation awareness as knowing kind of where you're invested, how much your portfolio is worth, if and when you need to be rebalanced, and so on. If the aid is doing everything for you, then you've lost track of all that stuff. And when it comes time to retire, you're potentially caught short. So for those reasons, we don't want the person completely disengaged. We want them at least monitoring what's going on. The other thing we see in the human factors literature is that people don't trust statistical aids, but they trust other people. So if we put somebody in a decision-making task where they're assisted by an aide, they don't like it, they ignore it, and they don't do very well. But if we put two people together, they collaborate a little more effectively. I think in this context, what that means is that people probably trust the aid more, trust the robo-advisor more, if it comes with or it's accompanied by input or guidance from a human as well.
And I think that there are a couple of things that I should probably make some observation is that, so robo-advisors in general is not one of those set it and forget it. Remember in the old days, and I hope that some people are probably don't know what I'm talking about. In the old days that we have the George Foreman's grills, that where you set it and forget it. And so I think that in this case, that in the financial area, the robo-advisor isn't something you set it and forget it. You can leverage using the robo-advisors to help you make smart decision about allocations. And oftentimes robo-advisor has a system built in to automatically rebalance it for you. But I think what you are suggesting is that besides the robo-advisor is still a good idea to interact with a human advisors, if you will, because they might potentially able to look at the entire picture, not just necessarily that particular account, because every one of us probably have multiple accounts in multiple institutions. Just having one account with a robo-advisor, that doesn't necessarily completely see the entire picture. The other questions that I have is, would you be able to take us through how these statistical decisions actually do for us in terms of looking at the application side?
Sure. So I guess if you want to hit we can, I guess you can just go through the bottom of the slide there. Yeah. We can kind of think of these things as operating at different levels or being more or less active for us. And again, this is all kind of drawing from applications in aviation and the military domain, driving, so on. But again, it can kind of be more or less in control, I guess. So it's sort of the lowest level. It can inform us. That means it draws attention to information that we might not notice. On the slide here, I've used a spell check as a kind of example. So a spell check is a statistical decision aid in that it spots something it doesn't recognize and it tries to figure out what you meant, right? So it doesn't know for sure whether that's an unusual word or whether it's really a typo or misspelling. So it's making its best guess, right? At the lowest level, it might kind of highlight that word, draw your attention to it so that you can check it yourself. At the next level up, it might give you advice, it might counsel you and recommend an alternative spelling. At the highest level, it can just take over and fix that for you. And you can see there's kind of a trade-off here. At the lowest level, there's more work for you to do. You have to, again, search for the things that it's flagged and fix them. At the highest level, it's doing more of the work for you, but there's a bigger chance that if it makes a mistake, you don't catch it. So even at that level, you're still involved, right? You still have to be watching to make sure it's behaving and doing what you want it to, that it hasn't replaced a word that word that you intended to type with something different. Kind of by analogy, the Robo-Advisors, those three levels, you might think of one that sort of assesses your portfolio for you, describes it for you. At the next level, one that sort of recommends changes to it. And at the highest level, then one that actually just carries out and automatically rebalances for you. Again, at each level, it's taking some of the workload off of you, but it's also taking you a little bit out of the process. You have to work a little harder to stay engaged and keep track of what's going on.
And I think that if you allow me to walk through an example here where I'm going to use my husband as an example. He works for a local government and they do have a 401k plan that he participated in. Although he's not involved as much as I am, basically I took over his accounting and I just kind of do things for him. But in their platform, they actually have the ability to, as soon as the participant log into the website, it shows you what portion is the pension portion, what portion is the portion that he personally contributed to. The portion that he personally contributed to shows the allocation and the performance of it. But one of the very interesting feature there was the system are able to calculate both from the pension and his own contribution and make a calculation based upon his age, based upon his current salaries. And it will have basically a pop-up box as soon as you log in and say, you have saved up to date of a percentage meeting your goal. And they're assuming that your goal is matching your current salary. So in his case, he saved enough. So the system actually tells him that, okay, you've got 100% matching your goal, but we do recommend you to save additional more and things like that. But what's interesting thing is that based on the chart that you have here, it did inform you based on their website of that. It also make some suggestions in terms of, okay, even though you save 100% of what you're supposed to, but they're still keeping in mind that they're not sure if that's the level of your goals in terms of living expenses. What they did was immediately they pop up in another message telling you that they encourage you to schedule an appointment with their advisor to speak further to do the retirement planning. So I'm assuming that from that analogy in their retirement website, it actually is doing the informs, the counsels, and hoping that participant will act upon based upon the message. Does that kind of summarize what you walk us through in terms of the informs, counsel, and act?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And again, obviously the benefit there is that your husband, if something changes, is aware of it and kind of knows his circumstances, knows the situation, rather than it presuming either that it should make the change or that it shouldn't, and that it should just carry on as it is. So it maintains what we again call situation awareness.
Yeah, one of the most interesting thing about that story was that because I was the one looking at it, and I actually asked him about the pension question, because pension was not necessarily explained very well. And I asked him to call human resource to find out more, which is kind of interesting, because without these process, I would not have even noticed that there's pension being factored into the overall calculation. And he actually prompted to call the HR and find out a little bit more about how they distribute the pension. So this is interesting that it's being factored into our day-to-day situation. Could you talk a little bit about the mechanical and holistic part of the decisions? I know that you provided this. I'm just going to go ahead and put that in here. In terms of, you mentioned earlier that sometimes these machine, whether or not it's a artificial intelligence or machine learning, they oftentimes could make better decision than us. Walk us through why is that, and is the better decision primarily shielding from our human emotion or something else?
Yeah, actually, so I've got these slides because I wasn't quite sure what to expect here. So I've got some random slides in there. I wasn't sure we need or not. Maybe you could skip ahead to slide 9. That might actually, one more.
Disuse?
Or yes, this is the one. Yep, I'm sorry, that works.
All right.
I'll be a little bit pedantic here. I apologize. This is sort of how I present this when I'm talking to students, whatever. I try not to belabor this, but I think this is a great study and it illustrates the point well. So when we talk about holistic versus analytic decisions, analytic decision is, again, following a rule or a recipe or an algorithm, and it's kind of a calculated decision. A holistic decision is just kind of a decision in our head, just sort of by intuition or by gut. This is a study comparing how people use those different modes, I guess, of decision making. So the task here, you're pretending that you're an admissions officer and you're predicting how well students are going to do in an MBA program. And you've got a profile for each student with their undergraduate degree and their test scores and so on. And your job is to predict on some measure of composite performance how well they're going to do at the end of the program. And you're also told that your office has a statistical model that makes the same predictions. And what you do is you start with 15 practice trials where you get some feedback. Then you make 10 quote unquote official, pretend official judgments, and you're earning $1 for each one that you sort of get right. So you've got an incentive to do as well as you can. You're also offered this proposition, rather than basing performance on your reward, your payoff on how well you did, you can base your payoff on how well the algorithm did. So if you were expecting to make 2 correct judgments, you're expecting the aide to make more than that, you should just trust the aide or trust the model. In this case, as in most cases, the model did better than the human. So on average, the people should have just deferred. They would have made more money if they trusted the model. What they did depends on what they saw during their feedback. And this is the sort of surprising bit. It looks like it's a little bit cut off there, but during the practice trials, they got feedback. What's the control group there? Well, the control group didn't get any practice trials. They just jumped right into their 10 judgments. Again, they're asked, do you want to base your payoff on your performance or what the aide did? And 65% of them say, I'll trust the aide more. It probably did better than me. The next little bar to the left, or excuse me, to the right, as they're doing the practice trials, each time they get a feedback that tells them how close they were to the truth or how far off they were. So they get a sense of how good they are at the task. Again, about 65% of them decide, I'm going to trust the aide. It's probably better than me. The next 2 are the surprising ones. So the next one, they did these practice trials. Each practice trial, they didn't know how well they did themselves, but they saw how good the aide was. So they would make their prediction. They would find out the aide, when it judged this student, was off by 10 points or whatever. Those people didn't trust the aide. So once people learned that the aide wasn't always perfect, that it occasionally made a misjudgment, they stopped wanting to rely on it. That last bar there on the right is the one that's the most surprising. So in that case, they're doing these practice trials. They see their own judgment. They see what the aide predicted. they can see that most of the time the model is doing better than them. They're watching the model outperform them, and they still don't trust it. They would still rather trust themselves than trust this model that just happens, well, is better than them, but is not quite perfect. So the implication is that when we're trusting some kind of automation or some kind of statistical rule like that, we assume it's good, and then as soon as we find out that it's not perfect, we stop trusting it. And that leads to, again, underperformance people, in this case, making predictions that are poorer than they should. This was a laboratory test. The same effects, the same phenomena have been shown in lots of real world circumstances. Again, medical diagnoses, forensic accounting, again, admissions decisions, and so on. So that's what we mean by holistic versus analytic. And whereas we should trust, or we should resort to those analytic decisions, those model-based or automation-based decisions, we don't like to do that. We like to try and beat the system.
As you were talking, and I'm thinking about Warren Buffett once said that typical people who wanted to retire someday is probably better off to invest in index funds such as S&P 500 exchange traded fund, things like that, because very few people actually outperform the index. And so there are a lot of people who listen to him and then just kind of trust the index fund overall. But there are still a minority group of people who tend to think that they can outperform the market. They want to pick their own stocks, and I'm guilty of that. Of course, I do pick my own stocks and stuff like that. And sometimes they do outperform, sometimes they're not. And there was also a study back probably about 10 years ago, a study between South Korea as well as Taiwan, that they actually went out and assessed the active traders versus the algorithm, if you will. So again, the active trader oftentimes loses in terms of performance. And so when you put it into the statistical way of saying is that oftentimes the index or oftentimes the machine actually does a better job in terms of performance. I think one easy way to argue is that we have so much emotion attached to our decision, and what we think may or may not be true, and oftentimes may potentially underperform against any type of algorithm that we have in place. So my questions to you is, what if the algorithm is wrong? How do we know if it's not wrong that we can trust that?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, I think that's a great question. It's actually a question I was potentially planning to turn around on you, so I might ask you as well. So the first thing we have to recognize is that sometimes the algorithm is going to be wrong. It has to be wrong. That's the nature of the world, right? That's the nature of a probabilistic decision, that we can't always be right. And what we have to accept is that even though it's wrong sometimes, what I have to accept, even though the aid is wrong sometimes, it's probably more right than me. So because the aid makes a decision or prediction that doesn't turn out the way we want, that doesn't mean that it's not useful. It means that the world is noisy and making the correct predictions is hard, right? There's no way to always be right. In cases like, say, air traffic conflict prediction, where it's warning you that the aircraft are on collision course, or even my collision avoidance in my car that beeps, right? I know right away. I get feedback whether it's making the right decision or not. If it tells me to do something and I make a mistake, and I figure out right away. I think what's a little bit more elusive about a robo-advisor is that the feedback is not that immediate. So again, my collision alert system beeps and there's nothing there. I figure out that it's made a mistake. If my robo-advisor doesn't doesn't make the sort of best possible allocation or make the right bet, I might not find out. I'm not sure. I'm not sure how I would know that. I'm not sure what the proper benchmark for comparison is or how long it would take me to notice. So how do we react when it's wrong? Well, most of the time we should just accept the fact that it can't always be right. If it's wrong too often, then probably it's going to be decommissioned or ought to be decommissioned. It's not working like it's supposed to. But in the context of financial planning, I think that's a little bit more, again, elusive of a judgment to have to make, whether it was how good its decision was. So I'd be curious.
I am kind of assuming that in the robo-advisor or financial services or financial planning industry in general, because we use historical data so much to make these changes in the algorithm, if you will. My assumption is that those probably get changed often to make corrections. So for example, the most recent GameStop as a stock that went out of kind of an outlier, if you will. You potentially may have an outlier or different asset class that is an outlier. And I would assume that the industry react to these very, very quickly. They may not thought about building them into the algorithm. Probably because of that, they will put that into the algorithm to address those kind of outlier in the future. That's my assumption. I'm assuming that's the case since picking a particular stock like a GameStop, which has so much wrong intention to go into it. The idea behind it was just trying to beat the big guys in the industry, which yes, it was successful for a number of days, but eventually has to come down to the fundamental. So I'm assuming that to address this kind of situation, Robo-Advisor may or may not be able to give you that immediate adjustment, like when you are driving a Tesla that has an automation behind it. But I think that over time, the designers behind the scene probably are building these outliers into their system to recognize changes like that. Is that a safe assumption? I'm assuming that that's probably what they're doing behind the scene.
I wouldn't presume to know what the Robo-Advisor designers are doing, although I trust they're making smart decisions. So they're updating based on current statistics or based on the math, I guess. I guess I'm thinking of it more from the perspective of the sort of the individual user who doesn't see what's going on behind the scenes. So I presume you're right in terms of the people developing the systems. And I guess the question is, I'm wondering about is how does an individual investor know whether they're being well served by the by the automation or not? If that makes sense.
Yes, I'm looking for my button here. Sometimes I think I have full control, but I don't. Okay, so and thank you for talking about disuse, but I couldn't help to wonder. You also have, I don't know if this slide or the next slide about misuse. Can we talk about the role of trust? I thought this might be an interesting slide for you to take us through it.
Yeah, sure. So, as I said, people tend to not like to use these things. What we want to do is design them so that people are more willing to use them when they should. When we say that people don't trust it, what we mean is that they don't expect it's actually going to be helpful, that it's actually going to improve their performance. And people sort of characterize trust in different ways, but as I sort of think about it, I think there are a few different characteristics of an automated system that contribute to whether we trust it and are willing to rely on it. So the most kind of basic, of course, is how good is it? And again, that assumes we have some way of assessing how reliable it is. But of course, The finding is that the less reliable, the more mistakes it makes, the less we want to trust it, the less we want to use it. I guess that's not too surprising, with the exception that, again, it doesn't take an awful lot of many errors. It doesn't take a big mistake from the aide to throw our trust way out of whack. So just occasional errors, even if they really don't compromise performance, even if we should sort of expect them, they undermine our trust quite a lot. Pushing back is an understanding of process, that is understanding how it works. So if we are just given the system and it tells us what to do, it makes recommendations, we don't know how it gets to that point. That undermines our trust. If we can understand how and why it's making the judgments, making the recommendations or decisions, predictions that it is, if we understand why it might go wrong, then our trust tends to be more resilient. We're less likely to give up on it when it occasionally makes a bad call or bad prediction. So if the user understands that the data are noisy and that it's impossible to be correct every time, and that these are, again, probabilistic decisions that naturally are sometimes going to misfire, that kind of builds in some robustness against mistrust, or distrust, I should say.
And I think that if I purely just looking at Robo-Advisor versus human advisor that is managing your account, that's assume Robo-Advisors, if from a performance perspective, is still continue to at least meet the standard benchmark, and the way they design the allocation is based on the client answering a whole bunch of questions, and so it will allocate to however the client's objectives upon their however they answer it, and ultimately maybe per quarter, per year, when the client's looking at their account, the performance still up to the bar in terms of the benchmark, and they continue to see their money grow over time. And Robo-Advisor, most likely with all the platforms that I interact with, they're all very, very easy to use. With that, that's probably why when I initially talked about, there were approximately about $2.2 trillion in terms of asset under management using Robo-Advisor. So that's a layer of trust, and probably that's not necessarily different from a human advisor, where the advisor will still go through the same thing, right? They are using a certain benchmark to measure their performance. They base upon the client's objectives, and some of these objectives could be measured based upon how far along that they are saving for in different type of objectives. So I would say overall, if it's a robo-advisors and human advisor, there's a certain level of trust. And for the robo-advisors to become more a mainstream platform, the more trust that there is on the client side, the more consumer probably will use robo-advisors compared to human advisor. What it comes down to, I think, is probably the cost. Ultimately, how much is going to cost the consumer to get automatic advice versus human advice. But that the element of trust I think that in addition to the element of trust here would be ultimately how much it costs, because that cost is going to eat in your overall performance. Is that still a true observation in terms of, if I bring the cost into the overall picture, it may potentially deter how the consumer actually react to the robo-advisors versus human advisor?
So the literature I've read on this says yes, yes, but it may actually not in the way we might expect. So obviously the appeal, or one of the supposed appeal of robo-advisors, is that they're less costly, more efficient, and ideally they can open up planning to or investments to people that might not otherwise be able, or have the resources for it. So people that don't have enough money to make it worthwhile to work with a human planner. The idea behind robo-advisors was that we can reduce costs, reduce the sort of cost of entry and the management costs and make it accessible to them. From what my understanding of the literature is that there's been less uptake on that than people were hopeful for. So obviously it's burgeoning. Younger people are more interested or willing to do that than older people, of course. More older investors and wealthier investors are actually more willing to spend the money on a human advisor. They like the human interaction. They trust the human advisor more. And so they are willing to pay the additional cost to have that human element of interaction. So the costs do matter, but at least for, again, the sort of older and probably a little bit wealthier investors, the value of the human planner outweighs the costs.
So really, in the other words, from a robo-advisor perspective, they do serve a very distinct clientele. And you're right, the younger generation tend to be using robo-advisor just because of the amount of experience that they have with technology. And also because of their age, they are not necessarily accumulated enough to even warrant that kind of human interaction. So you're right. So the robo-advisor really has a very distinct market that they are servicing. And that doesn't mean that it is exclusively for age group. It's probably in addition to the age group, also the purpose of using that may have make a difference in terms of building that. One of the things that as I was looking at your slide, you talk about misuse in terms of complacency, which I'm interpreting based on, I'm going to set it and forget it, and that's probably not necessarily the right thing to do. So in the absence of human advisor, let's just take my daughter as an example. She obviously, 25 years old, is not necessarily have a lot of money to invest. So robo-advisor probably would be a very good alternative for her. But for her busy schedule, and this is probably savings and investing probably isn't on her radar screen, finding her next mate is probably more on her target. So she might have the tendency of just set it and forget it. So what would you recommend for the younger generation or more of a robo-advisor audience to do in terms of to avoid misuse of a certain type of automation or statistical aids?
Well, ideally, again, we would like the user involved in the process, at least monitoring the process, so that if there's a rebalance, or obviously if her goals change. So if I decide that my son, I want him to go to a fancy private college instead of Oregon State College, then I have to go into his the Robo-Advisor 4S529 and update all that. So cases like that where there's a change in goals, we need the human to update the Robo-Advisor, be involved for sure. The advisor can't make those predictions by itself. Even without those kinds of changes, we'd like the person monitoring the process. So obviously it's good for me to know along the way how close we're getting to being able to pay for his college, and whether I need to be investing more, something's going off track. And if I'm not involved in that way, then when he gets to be 18 years old, I might again find out we're coming up really short. In cases where the person just isn't interested in that, whether it's just easier for them to, as you say, set it and forget it, I don't know if we can or should force them to be involved. But again, we'd like to at least invite them to monitor the process, to at least log in or update themselves on their progress, on their allocations every now and then, so that they've got some idea of their circumstances and aren't surprised down the line.
So really, from the advisor's perspective, even though if the clients are not actively engaged, you could still have process in place to remind them, right? Remind them to schedule your next meetings and things like that. At least that you are trying to intervene, that they are somewhat actively involved. Otherwise, you could potentially not necessarily work well. With what we talked about from an application perspective, if there's one advice that you could provide to financial planning professionals in terms of avoiding misuse and disuse of the Robo-Advisor, what would that be?
Let's see. If I think having you as the liaison between the advisor and the investor probably fights these problems, right? So the investor probably trusts you, right? So they'll take your advice more than they might take advice from a computer, from a statistical algorithm, and you're there to make sure they're up to speed, make sure they haven't lost situation awareness. So I think to the extent that for the investors that want that human interaction and can, again, afford it, having you there as that liaison is valuable. For the people who can't or don't want to, prefer to just be managing this themselves, designing it so that, again, we encourage them to take the advice, but we make sure they know what they're doing. Again, we keep them up to speed. Those are the important goals, I think.
Yeah, so kind of briefly summarize, I believe that even though robo-advisors can be a valuable tool for human advisors out there, but having that, leveraging the tool to give clients more attention in terms of helping the clients to be actively engaged is still tremendously valuable. Using the opportunity to engage with clients, to continue to build trust, that is still going to help the clients reach their goals from an overall objective perspective. So thank you so much for having this valuable information. Even though there's a lot more research that we could talk about it. So thank you so much, Dr. McCarley. We're so very glad to have you in Next Gen Mentoring Forum. It's such a informative session that I think every advisor could leverage the technology, but it could also use the technology to help increasing the trust by having active engagement with the client. I wanted to thank California Lutheran University School of Management Financial Planning Program for sponsoring today's Next Gen Mentoring Forum. California Lutheran University School of Management offers MBA in financial planning, helps financial advisors pursue a leadership position and grow their financial planning practice by deploying advanced financial planning, effective client communication, and streamlined practice management. Please sign up for our info session for more information. Our Next Gen mentoring session is on May the 4th at 1 p.m. Please join me to interview a financial expert, Mr. Bill Van Law, on the topic of how should advisors leverage the continuum of business models. And so thank you so much, and we'll see you the next time at the Next Gen Mentoring Forum on May 4th, 2021. Have a wonderful day, and thank you so much, Dr. McCarley.